Willow Creek Springs presents Healthy Living with your host, Joe Grumbine.
Well, hello and welcome to the Healthy Living Podcast brought to you by Willow Creek Springs. I'm Joe Grumbine and I'm your host, and I have with me today Jennifer Sweeney back to share her experiences. And Jennifer, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Well, it's so great to have you back. And I feel like we just left off our conversation. So while things are still fresh, I definitely want to jump back into, this conversation about, well, when we left off last time, you made a comment that really struck in my mind, and it was, "What's wrong with you?" And I can remember as a kid, when I was in fifth grade, my fifth grade teacher had to take my parents aside and say, "We got to have him checked out. There's something wrong with him," right? Because I was hyper, and I was in the gifted program, and they knew I was hyper, and they gave me stuff to do, but whatever, what's wrong with you? That's how I felt. Like, well, I didn't feel like there was anything wrong with me. I thought maybe there was something wrong with them.
Right.
But then you had another counterpoint, and why don't you pick it up from there? Because I really liked where that was going.
Well, it's not original to me. So a little bit about me. I started a foundation, Take a Second Look, because I want to educate people about, in order for them to take a second look, when someone is acting out of their dysregulated nervous system. So the flip from thinking what's wrong with you to what happened to you is a question. I don't really know if it's original to her, but Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah wrote a book titled "What Happened to You?" And it's a great book. You should pick it up. I really like it. I've done a book study on it with different groups on Zoom. Basically, when someone is acting out, no matter what age they are, 62, 45, 7 years old, it's because their nervous system is dysregulated. It is their brain, in a manner of speaking, telling them what to do. So when you ask what happened to you, you're talking about experiences that have happened in the past. More than likely in your childhood, doesn't always have to be, but that's where most of them will happen. Couple of definitions. Trauma comes from the Greek word wound. So trauma means wound. So when people say, that car accident was trauma, the car accident is not trauma. The car accident is a traumatic event.
Okay.
And the trauma is lodged in your body. It stays in your body. The shock of it stays in your body. So that kind of trauma is like a one-time trauma. Let me go over a few. There's all kinds of different types of trauma that can be in your body at the moment. And keep in mind that trauma is the wound that stays after the traumatic event.
So you're talking about like for a point of reference, like a concussion. Like when I was a kid, in the 70s, we didn't have cushions on everything. We had steel bars, and we swung on and we fell off and we conked our head on the concrete. And that happened to me many times. That was a trauma. That was a traumatic experience. But the trauma kept going because I cracked my head, and then whatever, the repercussion from that. So that was a type of trauma.
There's a difference between the kind of trauma that will have you end up in the ER. So a concussion is an actual medical condition where you might end up seeing a doctor. But in addition to that trauma, you also probably have trauma that is an emotional wound inside of you. Two separate types of trauma. And your concussion goes away. They fix up your broken leg, whatever. You recover from the car accident, your body does, but what stays inside you is also traumatic. And this can be all sorts of things. One common way that I've heard talked about it and that I don't really care for is big T trauma and then little t trauma. And in my opinion, trauma is trauma. And if you have it inside you and it's affecting your nervous system, then it doesn't matter if it was something ginormous like a car accident, or you coming home from school and finding your mother drunk on the couch every afternoon. That's also trauma, but it's trauma that kind of builds and builds and builds.
Well, the thing too, and I don't mean to cut you off, but sometimes
Okay.
I get an inspiration. We don't ever know what's doing what. And a lot of times the biggest things, like in the work that I've done with natural medicine and plant-based solutions to things, I run into people all the time that don't look sick, but they
Right.
have major issues. And the problem is like Western medicine says, well, the book says take 2 pills and because you weigh this much and this is what, but the truth is nobody really knows what those 2 pills are going to do for you because your system is unique. And the same thing, I think that holds true with every possible influence, whether it's positive or negative. We don't ever know. And there's no way maybe even to know how much, what did that do to you? Like that thing I remember flying off the swing and smacking my head. Well, it affected me for the rest of my life. I may not ever know
Right.
how that episode or that incident had affected future choices I made, but I'll bet you they did. And I think that we're all dealing with that.
Well, and was someone there to soothe you and to say, oh, poor little Joe, he hit his head? No,
Nope. Get
probably
up, you're
not.
okay.
And yeah, you're okay, get up, brush it off. And so that is an issue there. And I mean, we can also do a couple of episodes on attachment versus authenticity and talked about Gabor Mate's work.
Sure.
So there's acute trauma, which would be something that happens once, such as the car accident or your house burns down or whatever, your grandma passes away. There's chronic trauma, which is what I talked about, where if a kid comes home day after day after day and his mom is drunk on the couch. And of course, that can range from God knows what, a million different things. And then there's vicarious trauma, and healthcare workers and even I think educators suffer from this, where firefighters, they're seeing horrible things. Soldiers, they're seeing horrible things in their job every day. So these things are not happening to them. However, seeing these things day after day, it creates vicarious trauma inside them.
And I think probably depending on your level of empathy that you have, could be more or less. I mean, some people are good at compartmentalizing and shutting things out, and maybe they make good first responders. But it seems like you just mentioned, these are people that have the highest suicide rates of anybody, doctors, psychiatrists, first responders. They all have a breaking point, and as good as you are at shutting things out, I don't know that you're actually keeping it out. You're just disconnecting yourself from it. So
and then it will bubble up. There's the analogy of, it's like trying to keep a beach ball down in a pool, and if you keep trying to push it down, it's going to keep popping up over there, over here, wherever.
Right.
So yeah, exactly. There's a few more definitions of trauma, and one of them is individual, which obviously is sort of self-explanatory, but the second one is ancestral. And when we think about that type of trauma, I think about Native Americans, I think about African Americans, I think about obviously the Jews, not just during World War II, because anti-Semitism
their
is
whole heritage
here.
From the beginning.
Yes, still here.
Yeah.
And so there's many types of that. We can get really scientific and talk about epigenetics and how the genes change, but maybe that's for another episode. The third type I want to bring up in this group, individual, ancestral, and then collective. And collective would be something like the pandemic. Collective for the United States would be something like 9/11, or it just Pearl Harbor, something like that. That would be collective trauma that happened to all Americans, kind of thing. we had a brush fire near here that our school had to close. The fire came into the school's parking lot.
Wow.
It took months to get ash out of that. All the students obviously live in the area, and some of the teachers did as well. And that was collective trauma that we went through as a school, where some of the homes of our students came very close to burning, but thank God no homes burned at all.
Wow.
So there's different things like that as well.
So when we're talking about these things, and we also mentioned that there's no way to even chart even expectations for what is going to do what. It's not like in other areas of science where you have reactions that are documentable that'll happen the same every time. If you add 2 grams of this to 2 grams of that, that will always happen no matter what here on Earth. Whereas you can have 100 different people, subject them to the same trauma, watch them for the next 20 years and have 100 different results. So
Correct.
and in fact, even some people, I believe, because I think, free will's at play here. And if we're aware and alert and want to use our experience and environment to better ourselves, we can take a trauma and use it. Some people actually can be stronger and better for trauma. I believe it's like a forging process, that old saying, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Clearly that's not for everybody, but it can. And yet the other person, that same trauma could devastate and cripple emotionally to a point where their whole rest of their life is dysfunctional or incomplete or however. So, I mean, wow, it's like, what do you even do with any of that?
Correct. And I think sometimes as people get older, and this has happened with me, where I've worked through a lot of the traumatic things that happened to me as a child, and I am able to have better relationships with my parents because of that. Thankfully, before they passed, well, my mom is gone, but my dad is still alive, and we have a great relationship.
Good.
Because now I understand it was his childhood trauma that made him make some of the choices he made as a parent. And so as you become more understanding, and as you can take a second look, and that's why I named it that, what happened to these people, rather than what's wrong with my dad or what's wrong with my sister, then you can have a better understanding and have more compassion, and your relationships can be easier. Some of my family members are still pulling the same stunts, but they don't bother me as much because I'm just like, that's how they are. And I have boundaries now, stronger boundaries. And I sort of let it roll off my back more than I was able to.
Well, and I think there's so many dynamics at play here. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of conversations because everything that you're saying, you're opening up all these more and more in. I suppose when you open them all up, then you can start to close some of them back down and come to some kind of conclusions. But there's going to be a lot of opening first. But I'm one of these crazy people in a lot of ways. I mean, and I try to let the crazy be the good kind of crazy. I think there's good crazy and bad crazy. And for me, good crazy is I don't find myself restricted by the things that restrict most people. And I think that you can always find a good in anything, even a bad situation, a trauma, or a relationship. Every relationship has problems. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a relationship, right? Even the best ones, they still have issues. But then it comes down to that free will and that the choices that we make, which takes you all the way back to the very beginning of identifying where there is a problem, is when somebody starts making poor choices. But that very same person could have an awakening or an epiphany or a growth, if you will, and all of a sudden turn that poor choice into a good choice at any given moment, any time. And maybe that's the power that's inside of what you're talking about.
So since you brought it up, I want to talk a little bit about free will. Because I think you have to understand that every single free will decision or choice that we make is still informed by our brain. And I have just purchased a book called Determined by Sampolsky, where he maintains that there's no such thing as free will. And the more I learn about neuroscience, and the more I learn about how our brain literally controls everything, I'm beginning to think maybe he's right. I have to do some more research. But even
mostly
the choice,
right. I think he's mostly right most of the time. But then we have a trump card that we can always play when we want to.
But that trump card that you're playing is still informed by the circuits in your brain and the experiences your brain has had. And so it's not exactly free will, in my opinion. Anyway, we can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that could be, I mean, that has, I don't know how much that has to do with healthy living, but.
Well, I think everything has to do with healthy living when you're talking about a dynamic that affects your life, because it can go one direction or the other. So
right.
You're definitely correct.
So even the choices that we made, I mean, we showed up on time for the Zoom. We got up and we took a shower and we brushed our teeth and, you know, fed ourselves breakfast. Those are great choices. But again, I don't know that even that's free will. I've sort of, my brain is sort of telling me to do that, you know, and so I'm doing it, kind of thing. So anyway, that's a whole nother topic. But I just want people to understand, especially if someone's nervous system is dysregulated, more than likely their prefrontal cortex is offline, their amygdala is in control, they are just seeking safety. And their kind of safety might not be anything you'd ever think would make them feel safe, depending upon the family situation they grew up in. So lots of behaviors we don't understand. I just want you to, everyone, not just you, Joe, understand that it's their amygdala controlling their behaviors and their choices. In a nutshell.
I think too, if we understood that, so the work that you're doing, I can see a lot of benefits coming from. But if we understand that that person that's making poor choices isn't just being mean or destructive on purpose,
defiant,
then we can more likely be a little more compassionate, because we can recognize that, oh, you poor guy, you got a problem here, instead of you son of a whatever. And then our reactions, because everything is happening all the time, all at once, and it's all affecting everything all the time, all at once.
You should make a movie.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. But on a quantum or a macro level, it's happening, and we're influencing everything around us all the time.
Yeah.
So that influence can be pushing it towards something positive or something negative, and just our understanding of, oh wow, that poor guy, instead of even us reacting, even in a micro expression way or all the way to an overt action, you can influence maybe the rest of that person's life in some small way. Just from you having a little bit of understanding. So
and it might be the first time they've been understood, or just like, okay, I understand why you're reacting this way. I mean, your feelings are valid, and it might be the first time their feelings or their emotions have been validated ever.
Yeah. And remembering that, you know, for anybody who's like, oh, I don't know, remember that we're on a rock that's spinning around at 10,000 miles an hour through space. And it's going so fast, you can't even imagine it. We don't feel ourselves moving. But the point is, we are moving. And so when you take something that's moving and you shift it just a teeniest little bit, it goes somewhere else. Every single time. So we're moving that fast, that far. Every little thing we do changes where we're going. And it could, so that's what we have at our fingertips, just by smiling instead of frowning that one time. Who knows what that does?
Right. I agree. There's a lot that we can, and our energy when we go out into the, well, even when we're home, not just when we go out, but I mean, if you go out with a vibrant, you know, attitude of gratitude, And people pick up on that, and you just might lift their day while you're, checking out at Target or picking up your Starbucks.
So of all these different types of trauma, so you've got personal trauma, you've got collective trauma, you've got what was the other one? Ancestral trauma, all of these traumas that we all have all the time. Like we all have all of them. It's not like, oh, you got that one and you got that one.
Right.
We all have all of them on multiple layers all the time, no matter what. There's no getting away from it. Is there an influence that most people, or maybe that stands up as one that is more prevalent than another?
One I didn't mention is called complex PTSD. And it's differentiated from PTSD that when soldiers started coming back from the war, I think the Vietnam War, that's where the term PTSD came up. But now we know that something they call complex PTSD is relationship trauma. Now, obviously, that is a very vague word and encompasses a whole lot of things. But people who've never been in a car accident, never had their house burned down, never been to war, can have complex PTSD just by the dynamics in their home when they were raised. And again, that could be like 2 or 3 different podcasts, but they learn certain coping mechanisms, so to speak, in order to survive in that home. And that's where we can talk about attachment and authenticity. And in order to survive in that home, because really a 2-year-old cannot survive on their own. So they have to learn coping mechanisms if things are not safe there. And then those coping mechanisms come into the classroom, come onto the soccer team, come into high school, come into the job world. And if they're not taught how to bring their nervous system back to a regulated state, they can have a whole bunch of trouble in life.
Yeah, and I think that maybe explains a lot of things, if you think about it. We have these generations that, people paint with a broad brush. Oh, this generation was like this, and this generation was like that. Well, obviously, we can observe some things about big groups of people when you step back far enough and you can observe what you see. That doesn't necessarily mean you understand what you see. It just means you're observing some things and what caused them. You can look back at what and say, well, these people acted this way and they all had these things happen to them, and you can begin to maybe form some opinions. But you really have to look deep and spend time. And I can't, I can see it would be a life's work for even one person to figure out one person's issues to do it well.
Yeah. And so my focus is not figuring out anyone's issues. My focus is explaining neurologically what's happening, number one. And then number two, I want to give people tools for regulating their own nervous system, their children's nervous system. Nice. As far as figuring out what happened, that would be, in my opinion, the domain of, say, talk therapy, something like that. We can talk maybe another time about the ACEs study that was done about 25 years ago. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Okay. So that study did examine childhood experiences and health outcomes in adult life. So that would be another great topic for a podcast.
Oh, absolutely. And also just things that I've noticed from previous generations till today. And for me, it all has a lot to do with healthy living, because these are things that affect everybody. Environmental issues, food allergies, things like what we call autism or on the spectrum. That didn't even exist when we were kids, or maybe it did and we didn't know it. Right. Or maybe everybody has it. And I mean, I'm just saying the awareness and diagnosis of certain things maybe is what's helping us to understand that there's reasons why people behave certain things. And then, there's also things like, the nuclear family and, single parent families and the differences between, the baby boomers age and these last several generations. And all of these things are diet. I mean, my goodness, look at the difference between, let's go back 200 years ago, which is nothing in our ancestral DNA, to today.
Yeah.
We would probably not do well on that diet, and they certainly would die quickly off of our diet.
Right.
We're the same human beings, in 200 years. So all of these things to me are huge factors of even our longevity today. Are there's so many different situations that we can notice that generally are negative, right? You don't see any of these things as, oh, I'm so much better because, I have this allergy, or was exposed to this, that, or the other thing. And I can't help but wonder if many of these things are connected in some way to this associative or disassociative, your neural pathways connecting right or not, your prefrontal cortex running the show, or your amygdala running the show. I mean, those are two that's Jekyll and Hyde if there ever was one. You've got
Right.
the thinking
Right.
man, and you've got the animal.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. You've got the running away from the tiger because he's going to eat you. And then you've got the prefrontal cortex saying, wait, you have a spear. Take your spear, shoot the tiger. But, when the tiger's 3 times the size of you in prehistoric times, you just run away.
And then we go fast forward all the way to, you take humanity at wherever it started into wherever it is, but then there's a place in our minds or our spirits that we would call our spiritual being, spirituality and higher thinking, where we have a place where we can overcome all these things, in the meditative or prayer state, getting into your, brain waves acting in a particular way that's the opposite of the fight and flight side.
Right.
And you can go tune in all the way onto another side where you can be in a healing state or a place to overcome.
Yep.
And is that part of whole thinking?
Yes, I have a very strong spiritual belief. I, for the most part, don't talk about it simply because I want to stay scientific and factual, and there's this study and that study, yada yada.
Sure.
But just to touch on meditation and sort of take this in a different direction than you had, for some people, sitting still and meditating is very much activates their trauma.
Oh.
And that is not safe at all. So I know there's several people that, just ancillary in my world, they're like, oh, meditation. And I'm like, well, for some people, yes, but for some people, no, it
Right.
just isn't gonna, it's just not gonna work. That doesn't work for them. They need active things. They need to do the shaking. They need to run. They need to do something active. They, sitting and meditating is not gonna cut it for them. And maybe at some point it will. After they've learned to regulate their nervous system in a different way. But usually something movement based, like digging in a garden,
Yes.
harvesting vegetables, all those things you're talking about. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think that's, I'm sure our pals are going to cross in our conversations where we start getting into, and I appreciate you bringing it in because, I always look to talk about the problems because it's important to recognize problems,
Right.
but also really focusing on solutions and ways to overcome things is really what this is about.
Right.
And positive actions and positive motions and awareness and conversation. We live in this world of texting and typing and abbreviated words and emojis, and nobody even communicates anymore. And that's why I think that this is important, because we're having a conversation and we're being mindful of each other and stopping to the other one talking, thinking, listening to the other one. And I'm really trying to get what you're saying so that I can share it and expound on it or ask more questions. And I think that we live in this world where today people don't do any of that.
I
And,
know.
and so if we can go and share these, I think really your messaging is key to all of this, because most people are going through their life not even thinking about it, not even being aware. And we cause, I think, most of our problems by not realizing something or another, right? We just bumble our way through life and we step on the rake and it whacks us in the head, and we don't even
Right.
connect the headache with the rake sometimes, and we just keep
Right.
worrying.
That's a
So,
very good example. Yeah.
well, I've had it
So,
happen a few times. So
yeah. So that's why my initial uh, purpose was simply to educate. But then I had a few people say, okay, now what? And I was like, oh, solutions. How do we regulate our nervous system? Simple ways to do that, simple ways to teach your kids. So then I always make sure that I include some of those as well.
well, I think that this is fascinating, and I also am just fascinated by the brain and what makes it work, and the fact that we know a lot more than we did when I was a kid, and I was fascinated back then, but we still don't know anything. I mean, as every time we learn something, we just open up a door that could totally undo the laws of physics as we know it, or it might carry us a little further closer towards our assumptions. And we don't
Right.
know until we know, but we're understanding more and more things, and things like neuroplasticity and neural pathways and the brain's incredible ability to heal itself
Yeah.
and to protect
Yeah.
itself. And like you said, your brain's keeping you alive by causing you to behave badly, even if it isn't doing that very well. It's doing
Well,
the best it can.
yeah, it's your brain thinks that this behavior that you and I might call misbehavior, that person's brain, the kid's brain, whoever, thinks they're keeping the kid safe because this is
Right.
a mechanism they've learned probably at home.
Right. Well, and I think that's a great place to end this one. Unfortunately, these things they wind up quicker than I wish, but I really like the conversation, and I
Me
think that
too.
the fact that it's kind of going all over the place is good initially, because it just means that it's exciting and that
Right.
it's opening up a lot of doors. As we continue these conversations, we'll be able to focus and drill down deeper into some of these things and start looking at some solutions and even explore the problems. I think that in the problems lies the solution so many times, and being able to spot a problem or identify a problem as a mechanical rather than, like you say, a good or bad thing,
Right.
because good or bad, man, that's pretty heavy. Like, if I don't want to be just good or bad. I want to be
You want to
hopeful.
be regulated or dysregulated, and you can always come back to regulated.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That certainly is a lot
Yeah.
more reasonable.
It's
So,
kind, it's kinder, and it's actually really what's happening.
right.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And, I think really, I guess our goal would be to cause people to have the tools to stay regulated and to identify when you're not regulated and find ways
Yeah.
to
I think it's
disengage that.
almost impossible to stay regulated. But I think if you can recognize the state of dysregulation early on, use some of your tools, and come back to regulation fairly quickly,
Well, I
that's
think
the key.
you're right. You're right. And I think that that's exactly what happens is it's a tool, and we're always cycling back and forth into everything. We're awake, we're asleep, we're hungry,
Yeah.
we're full.
Yeah.
Everything's always cycling and around. We're happy, we're not so happy. We're manic, we're a little sad. I mean, all of these things happen all the time. And so, but as you get a key or a tool, you find each time you use it, it's maybe a little easier. You get a little
Right.
more adept at solving that same problem, because I've seen that before. You play chess and you see a certain opening, you're like, oh, I know what to do for the next 5 moves. First time you did it, you didn't, you got whooped by it. Then the second
Right.
time you figured out one move, and then eventually, well, it's the same thing with our whole thing. And whether it happens consciously or unconsciously, I think it's happening all the time. So discussing these physiological, neurological issues, I think if we can get our head around it and recognize, I think it can help us to create our own tools to, you know,
Yeah.
switch back and forth between these states.
Yeah.
So, well, I am tickled. I really think that we've got a lot to talk about. And
Okay,
as much
great.
as we just shared an episode, I think we've got a lot more. I appreciate your time coming in here. And as always, I'd like to give you a chance to end the show with your plug. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how to get a hold of you and all of that good stuff?
So Joe will post the link to my little website, and then you can fill out the form, the Google Doc, and let me know that you're interested in having me speak. Always want to emphasize that I speak for free. If you are local and you want me to speak in person, I will be happy to come. I have a Zoom account. I can do Zoom all over the world, and I'm in California, but if you want me to come to Minnesota, we will talk about travel expenses. Other than that, hope to see you on my little website.
Fantastic. And stay tuned, folks. One day we're going to have Jennifer at the Gardens of Hope doing one of
Yes.
her presentations live in our garden. So thank you
Yes.
so much.
You're
And,
welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you all for watching. This has been the Healthy Living Podcast brought to you by Willow Creek Springs, and we will see you next time.